by now. Our presenter is Cody Laplante, who's the founder of eye.t. He's also a teacher of students with visual impairments. Our challenges, are these at all familiar to you? Screen reader instruction sometimes can be boring for students and for teachers. Sometimes you have students who are resistant to learning screen readers for any number of possible reasons. There's a lack of available curriculum or pathways to introduce screen readers. Many people just don't think there's any way to really do it unless they come up with their own instructional things. And we're going to see that there are some things that are available to you. It's difficult to engage in student from the first moment of a screen reader lesson at times, especially if they're not really wanting to do it in the first place. And there's a need to build repetition into lessons that can be sporadic in nature. Maybe you're not able to have screen reader lessons as often as you would like. So how do you make them where they're going to be the most helpful? We'll address a lot of those different things today. Our learning objectives, we're going to define a do now in the context of screen reader lessons. So do now, you'll hear that term quite a bit today. We're going to identify 3 reasons why a do now is an important part of a screen reader lesson. Identify whether a do now activity is meaningful or meaningless. We'll identify 3 potentially meaningful do now activities that can be used in a screen reader lesson. So quite a bit today. You'll hear a lot about do nows. So let's turn it over to Cody to get us started.
All right. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you being with us today. Whether or not you joined us for part 1, welcome to part 2. Now, before we even get started in the do now, I do want to start out by saying that it's very, I think a lot of people, when we ask, oh, do you create screen reader lesson plans for your screen reader lessons, a lot of people are like, oh God, I can't even imagine putting a screen reader lesson plan together. And I think when I talk to teachers and other people, I tell them I don't necessarily write down those lesson plans in my head. Before I walk into a room with a student teaching a screen reader, I'm not writing out a lesson plan. And you'll see we have a lesson plan template for you today that we'll show you in a second. I'm not sitting there filling out the lesson plan template. But what I do and what I would love for everybody to do when they walk into a room ready to teach a screen reader is to go through these components that we go over in our heads, right? If you're itinerant, you're driving to a school, you're thinking to yourself, all right, what's the do now going to be? What's the, do it in your head. Doesn't necessarily have to be on paper. There's so many other pieces of paperwork that we have to take care of. But for sure, going through all of these components in your head is a great thing to do. Now, today, I want to make sure that we understand that the whole point of this series of 1, 2, 3, and 4 is to make screen reader instruction meaningful. Now, we say the fun way, right? We want screen reader instruction to be fun, and there are fun components, but we really, really, really want to focus on that meaningfulness to get those students to buy into our screen reader instruction. Now, I know there's a lot of beginners out there today, and that is totally fine. What we're going over today, we will go over a little bit of screen reader technique, like using different methods to use a screen reader in different ways. But today we are going to be talking mainly about how do you as a teacher approach screen reader instruction with your students. Okay. Now we're going to go on to our learning objectives, which we already went over. So we can kind of skip this slide. It's just a second slide. And I want to get your guys' opinion. So right now I have a slide on the screen. It says, we're going to ask some questions. The way that you do this is, Betsy Ann, if we could drop that link in the chat, you're going to click on the link pollev.com/Cody L901. So it's POLLEV.com/Cody L CODYL 901. And I have some questions up there for you guys that I want to hear your opinions. So I'll show you those in a second. If you do not have access to doing this, you can do this with your phone by texting Cody L901 to the number 37607, but the computer link works a lot better. So if you can click on that computer link in the chat. That would be the best way to do this. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to show you guys. Yep. I'm going to show you guys our poll everywhere poll. Oh, and here's our Baltimore trivia. We already got some responses in here. So our first question here is, what are some feelings that you would associate with a screen reader instruction, right? And people are saying empowerment. That's awesome. I love people that put really positive things in here. Absolutely. I feel you. Overwhelming. Dread is a big one that just came up. Overwhelming, challenging, independence, which is great. Anxious, inadequate as a teacher. Wow, that is a big emotion-filled word. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many times that I've felt, I'll tell you a story after this about my own experience of feeling inadequate as a teacher, for sure. Independence, complicated, absolutely. Uncertain, unsure, overwhelming, scared. So many things that are not, there are some really positive things in here, but so many of these words that you guys are putting in are really, they don't feel very good. Unfamiliarity, intimidated, interesting, full of possibilities. That's great. Teacher says overwhelming, inadequate, intimidating. Yeah, so really lots of things that that it's really hard to, I'm going all over the place now. There we go. Let's see, this one just came in. My auditory processing is not as fast, and I feel stupid when I'm trying to listen to where my students are at. Yeah, there's so many things that are intimidating about screen reader usage, and really all of these strategies that we'll talk about today and in this series are going to help to overcome some of those feelings. Also, I want you guys to think about if this is how you feel as a teacher, right? It's probably how your students feel as well, right? Lots of students that I've taught currently and in the past, you can see when a student comes and they don't know what's going on in class, their classmates are on a computer and they don't have the skill set to use the computer like the classmates do, and they kind of get thrown into this screen reader instruction. It's really all of these terms: unfamiliarity, intimidated, overwhelming, anxious. These are probably things that they feel as well. And that's what we're here trying to alleviate, is with really good screen reader instruction, planned, meaningful instruction. Maybe we can do a little bit to mitigate some of these feelings, right? I'm going to move us on to the next question. Make sure that activates. So you should see that pop up on your screen. This question says, why is it hard to learn how to use a screen reader? Why do you guys think it's hard to learn how to use a screen reader? You can answer from the point of view of your students or from the point of view of you as a teacher. This particular answer, you can either type in your own answer, or if you see an answer that you agree with, you can upvote it, okay? TVIs were not trained in prep programs. Absolutely, I was not trained how to use a screen reader in my university prep program, not to the level that we need, right? The shortcut. Why is it hard? Oh, shortcuts. There's lots of shortcuts, right? Lots of shortcuts, lots to remember. Too many keyboard commands to remember. We don't use it, right? There's so many things that we can do as teachers to learn a screen reader, but at the end of the day, we're not users, right? If well, some of us may be, but those of us who are not, sometimes it's hard to keep up on those skills. It's not something that I would use daily, so lots of time in between. Yeah, lots of time in between. It's just like Braille. When you don't have a Braille reader, your Braille skills get a little rusty, right? Many AT specialists do not know blindness tech. Absolutely. No repetition. We're going to talk a lot about repetition. All right. Now, if you haven't already, take a look at some of the things that your peers have written and upvote ones that you agree with. Okay. Upvotes ones that you agree with. I would love to get things that you guys agree with, right? We want to see ones that are kind of at the top. The top response right now, it says lots to remember. Absolutely. Second one says lack of training, and also websites are very cluttered. It's really hard to understand when those websites are inaccessible or cluttered, isn't it? Too many key commands to remember. The user experience is different. Absolutely. Let's see what's going on here. Yep, we got lots of upvote. The lots to remember one is super popular right now. And that's something that it's really important that we kind of change the way that we learn screen readers, because the way that I advocate to learn screen readers is not to memorize. It's not to memorize, it's to learn the concept behind, because once you understand how a screen reader works, then you can start to guess those key commands, and you usually guess correctly, okay?
And Cody, we've also been getting a lot of responses in the chat.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so I really love an answer to a question that came in earlier, that what's it like learning or using screen readers? It's like being poked by a toddler, yelled at by a boss, and trying to land the plane as a chef.
That is,
I love
wow.
that descriptive language.
It's amazing.
I feel like we can all step into that that mindset. What's coming in the chat for this question, why is it hard to learn how to use a screen reader? One response is it's hard because the student is trying to link with both the screen reader and the program application on the computer. So
yes,
essentially two different interfaces at the same time.
absolutely.
And a longer response is that there are many commands to remember and the terminology is new. It's almost like teaching break to somebody, and not to mention if they have no vision, they have to kind of picture the layout in their head of the screen, which makes it pretty difficult.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I think a lot of our frustrations, and we're gonna get into a lot of the instruction, but if we have time, we can totally get into the way to approach screen reader instruction. But a lot of that is just understanding that your student, when a screen reader is on, it's almost like having a different device in front of them, right? We don't use it like you and I use a computer as a sighted person, right? We don't interact with it with the graphics and the buttons and the graphics and all these different things. They would interact with it in a very, very different way with different patterns. So it's very difficult when you try to interact with a screen reader when you're trying to also interact with the visual display. It gets a little confusing, but absolutely, that's really great responses. Let's move on to our final question. What makes a screen reader lesson boring? And this is where we kind of get into what we're going to talk about today, right? What makes a screen reader lesson boring? Again, you can put in your own responses or you can upvote your peers. Repetition. That's interesting. I like it. Tedious feeling. Yeah, tedious for sure is a good word for it. I love that word. Robotic voice. Instructor struggling with commands, concepts. Rote memorization for sure. No meaningful use. Let's see what's at the top. Yeah. Lack of enthusiasm. Repetition is popular. Instructor struggling with commands and concepts. Right now it's 3 votes. That's popular. Rote memorization is getting up there. And no meaningful use. That's getting up there too. Really great ideas. Absolutely. So I'll leave this poll up so you can continue to answer, but I'm going to run back to our slideshow and we're going to start to get into what we're going to do today. So I'll stop sharing my screen here. And we'll start sharing that slideshow. And we're going to get into what we're going to learn today. And that is one component of our screen reader lesson, which we'll talk about. Yeah. Cool. So Nikki, if you're, yeah, perfect. Awesome. All right. So we're gonna take a break here from our main purpose. We're gonna kind of go back and remind ourselves, if you were there, or review if you weren't, what we did in our first part 1 of 4. Now, if you were not there, or if you were, I'll remind you, throughout this entire series, we're going to come back to this slide, right? What are we trying to accomplish, right? What are we trying to accomplish in a screen reader lesson? Well, we're trying to accomplish structure, right? So making sure that our lessons have a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're trying to accomplish clarity of language, making sure that we are using the correct vocabulary words of the screen reader, and also consistently using them. So not just teaching them and not just going over them, but consistently using them and using them throughout your lesson. Consistency, right? There's a difference between repetition and consistency. We'll talk about repetition today and how it can be useful. But if too much repetition can be boring, we want to make sure that we're not just repeating the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. We're using it consistently. So we're using the same concept and doing it in the same way with a little bit of novelty sprinkled in, with a little bit of difference, right? Meaningfulness. We always want to make sure that what we are doing is meaningful. That means we're connecting it to the student, whether we're connecting it to what they're doing in the classroom, they can see how it can be used, or we're connecting it to something that they like, right? Novelty. I just used that word again, right? Remember, we need to have consistency and novelty to make something meaningful or interesting. And then, of course, we can sprinkle in some fun, right? Why not have fun while we're teaching, right? So that's what we want to accomplish. Now, given our do now, and I know it's coming next, I think, if we can move on to the next slide, given our do, oh, maybe not, just kidding, I'm off. But what we're going to do before I go into the spiel I was about to is we compiled a bunch of materials for you all. The first one is the screen reader skills progression. As always with APH webinars, we have our materials up on the APH website, which Betsy Ann, if you could drop that link in the chat, that would be great. And then I also have a Google Drive with everything in it as well. As we do that, I'm going to share my screen one more time, and I'm going to show you this Google Drive link. Okay. So here's my Google Drive link. So what you're going to see is you're going to see part 2, do now. All right. If you're on the Google Drive link, we have our training overview, and we also have our slideshow here, but you can go into the folder named materials. Now, the materials, we have 3 different things here. The first one is answers, what do I teach? And that's our screen reader skills progression. The screen reader skills progression is an overview of objectives from beginning to the end of a screen reader user's progression of what you should be teaching or what you can teach, right? So starting with, it's divided into 4 phases. Phase 1 is reading. Phase 2 is writing. Phase 3, the internet. And then phase 4, system navigation, file management, okay? And we go from the objective, students will be able to turn on and off the screen reader literally from the very beginning. We go through all the way to objectives like students will be able to use OCR features to read inaccessible material. The students will be able to use the virtual cursor and mouse keys as backups for to access inaccessible elements. So we really go from the beginning to the end. If you don't have a copy of this, definitely download it because there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, if you are asking a lot of those questions about feeling inadequate, feeling like you don't know the commands, this is the first step that you want to do. The reason why is because in this document, you'll see that our vocabulary words are underlined. For example, in this second one, be able to utilize modifier keys such as Control, Alt, Shift, and Enter as a modified key command. Notice that modifier keys and modified key command are underlined. Why? Because that is the language that is used in the screen reader manuals. So if you feel like I need to teach my student something, first of all, you can test if they know this, starting from the top. And then if you find an objective that you want to work on, what you do is you type that into Google, type those words into Google, type those words into do a find in the JAWS JAWS manual, do a find in the NVDA manual, and find those words, because I bet you then you'll be able to find those key commands. So this is like the beginning starting point. If you are feeling inadequate as a teacher, teaching screen reader instruction, this is what do you teach? Literally, what do you teach? I'll tell you, before I move on to my next material, I'll tell you a story. I started my career at the Maryland School for the Blind, and I was a technology instructor, and all I did all day was teach screen readers to students who needed to learn how to use a screen reader. And this question of what do I teach was my biggest struggle, right? Was my biggest struggle, because when you get to a point where you're like, I know they have to access the internet, but what does that even mean? What is the objective that I'm doing? Like, to be able to access a website is so broad. What am I teaching them, right? What's the lesson going to look like? The reason that we created this at IT is because that was a question that I had and still have as a teacher. And this is something that I use in my daily practice for all my students. So if you don't have a copy of that, definitely download it from our Google Drive. The next thing is our lesson plan template. Now, there's an accessible version that I believe is available on the APH website. It has the exact same content, but there's also on the Google Drive, there's also one that kind of, for sighted users, it kind of spaces everything out so it's easier for somebody who's low vision to use, okay? And this lesson plan template is really all of the components that we're going over in the series, right? We'll talk about that in a second as well. But if you do this in your head on your way, you say, what's my objective? I know what I'm teaching. What's my do now? I know what my do now is going to be. What is my what and why, my vocab, my key commands, my patterns? You literally go through this lesson plan template in your head. That will send you on your way as far as the beginning of creating really great screen reader instruction. Okay, so those are the materials we have. We also have, if we start sharing our slideshow. Oh, I'm sorry. I want to show you one more thing. I'll show you this at the end of the webinar as well. But if you want to see the key commands, right? What you can do is go to itvision.com and put that link in the chat. We can put it in the chat now if we can, but we'll also share it at the end. And what you can do is you can go create a free account, and then up at the top, you can go to free resources, okay? And we have all of these screen reader cheat sheets. So JAWS, NVDA, and Chromevox screen reader cheat sheets with commands that follow the same language as that screen reader skills progression. So that is available on our website as well, okay? Now, if we could start sharing the slideshow again, we'll kind of move on. And are there any questions about any of that, Betsy, in the chat? Anything that anybody wants to know?
No, most of the questions that were coming into the chat were about finding the information. For people who are having trouble finding it on Access Academy, feel free to look at the Google Drive links that have been shared. If you go to the first Access Academy or APH from homepage, you'll see Excel first, the Excel Academy. You need to scroll past that to find the Access Academy information. The one question that did come in, here we go. Modifier key is like the Chromevox modifier that is in the place of the caps lock on a Chromebook.
Yes, kind of. A modifier key, that's a great question. And as you guys have questions, even if it's on a tangent, definitely put them in the chat because I love going on tangents. Modifier keys are any key that you are holding down in order to change the function of something else. So on Chromebooks, you actually have 4 modifier keys. You have the control key, right? Because you can hold down control and do control C, right, to copy. You have the alt key. You have the shift key, because shift, you're holding it down and typing a key and it makes a capital. It's changing the function. And you have the Chromevox modifier, which is search, right? Which is in the same place as a caps lock. So yes, kind of that Chromevox key that is in the same place as a caps lock is one of 4. But don't forget about those other ones, those ones that everybody in the computer and everybody in the world uses modifier keys. It's just something that as screen reader users, we want to make sure that we teach our students modifiers keys explicitly. So great question. Cool. So what we're going to do is kind of just setting the stage here. There are 5 components in this series that we are going to go over of a screen reader lesson that can be really effective. Those are the objective, right? We all know about the objective that was in part 1. The do now, the instruction, which was also in part 1, the practice activity, and the assessment activity, okay? And today, if we move on to the next slide, we are covering the do now. We have already done objective. We have already done instruction. If you want more information on that, go to the recorded part 1. We'll go over a little bit of this in the next slide, but today we're going over the do now. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Now, last time, I'm going to go do a quick overview of last time. We went over our 4 guiding principles of good screen reader instruction. If you want more information on that, we have a full free mini course on our website at itvision.com going over the 4 guiding principles, okay? Last time we also covered instructional sequence versus a lesson. Remember, last time we went through an instructional sequence and it had those 4 guiding principles, and it's a beautiful sequence, it's great, but it wasn't a lesson. Why? Because lessons require that the student, number one, is engaged in the lesson, right? In the instructional sequence I showed you, I'm just talking to you like a webinar, right? I'm just talking to you. There's no engagement from my students, no engagement from my learner. I don't know if you've retained the information, right? That's number one. And number two is because you're not being engaged. You're going to kind of drone out if I'm just talking at you. And it's a skills-based thing that you need to learn, right? So it's an instructional sequence. This whole webinar, it's an instructional sequence. It's not a lesson, right? A lesson requires engagement, requires that I understand that you've retained the information that I'm giving you, okay? Now, number 3, an overview of each component. We talked about each component just in this broad overview. Remember, I'm going to give you this prompt now. Remember, a do now is that beginning activity. We'll talk about this a little bit more in depth, but it's that beginning activity. It's a 10-minute scaffolded activity that creates engagement from that first moment of instruction. Okay. And we went over all the other components as well. Practice activity, assessment activity, objective instruction. We also talked about objectives and why they're important. If you write a really good objective, you already have planned the main part of your lesson, right? And then talking about what's the difference between an instructional objective, right? The instructional objectives are like those in the screen reader skills progression. And a personalized objective, you add that condition, you add the criteria, and you make it an IEP goal, right? And why do we use each? Instructional objectives, we teach to classes, we teach in lessons. Personalized objectives, we use in individualized instruction like IEP sessions, okay? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. If you want any more information on that, go to part 1 because we talk about all of that in lots of depth. Now this is where my spiel was going to come. So which of the following, this is a poll question that will pop up. Which of the following is accomplished in a do now? Is it structure? Remember, what are we trying to accomplish in a screen reader lesson? Structure, clarity of language, consistency, meaningfulness, novelty, or fun. And you might be like, what's going on? I haven't learned any of this yet. That's okay. We're just trying to see from your first thinking about what a do now is, which do you think are accomplished? All right. What do we accomplish by having a do now? And these results are coming in. Awesome. All right. Everybody's kind of answering. Our biggest one that we got is meaningfulness. Everybody says that if you add a do now, you're going to increase the meaningfulness of your lesson for sure. We'll talk about that today. We also, I mean, everybody said there's some people that say everything is highlighted. There's nothing on here that people say you don't accomplish that with the do now. But the biggest ones that we got are structure, clarity of language, and meaningfulness that people say. We also get consistency, we get novelty, we get fun. But that's just to get you thinking about, remember, we're always going to that first slide. We want to accomplish those 6 things: structure, clarity of language, consistency, meaningfulness, novelty, fun. Do now is one of our tools that we can use to get there. We'll talk a little bit about that as we keep going. All right, so let's move on to that next slide. Yeah, so this is what I identified. So when I was creating the slide deck, I answered this question for myself. What do I think we accomplish in a do now? I said we accomplish structure. Why do we accomplish structure? Well, because remember, structure is our lesson has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If we always start with the do now, we always start with a beginning. Always start with the beginning. It also accomplishes consistency. I'm going to show you some do nows later in the webinar, and you'll see how you can do these do nows every single time you do a screen reader lesson. Consistency is super, super important for those really tedious skills, right? We heard that word tedious in our poll, like turning on the screen reader, opening programs, logging in. These are things that we do all the time. And if we practice them consistently in our do now, for example, it will help us to remember it and practice to automaticity, which is another word that's going to come up soon. Meaningfulness. Our do nows need to be meaningful, right? A lot of times I say to people that I train, to organizations, create a do now, and they say, great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have them open up keyboard help and find all of the modifier keys. Like, that is not meaningful, right? That's not meaningful. It sounds like great practice, but at the end of the day, the student is going to be like, why do I have to do this, right? So that's famous example of the student in the math class saying, when am I going to use this in life? When am I going to open up keyboard help and find all the modifier keys? You're never going to do that. Whereas a meaningful do now being logging in, turning on the screen reader, going to Google Classroom, those are all meaningful do. It's things that we do as a do now every day, right? What do we do when you get to work? Open your laptop, log in, right? If you're a screen reader user, you turn on your screen reader. If it's not already on, you go to your email, right? We all do nows every single day. I'm losing the word, but simulating, there we go. Simulating that in our lessons make it really meaningful. It makes our students feel like they're adults, like they're contributing to society. Novelty. You have to create a little bit of novelty in your do now. Otherwise, it just becomes repetition, right? Like you said, that's why screen reader lessons are boring, because they're repeated and repeated and repeated. You have to create a little bit of novelty, and we'll talk about how to do that. And fun. We can make our do now fun. Not all do nows are going to be fun, because not all tasks are fun, but we can make it fun, and we'll show you how to do that as well. Okay, so that's my answer to the question. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to define, really define what a do now is, right? And this is my definition here: a 10-minute meaningful scaffolded activity that your learner can practice to automaticity. Lots of big words in there. We'll go through those one by one. Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, so we're going to be going over one by one, 10-minute, meaningful, scaffolded, and automaticity. What do these words mean, and how do we use these words and use these concepts to make a really engaging do now? Let's see. All right, so it's 10 minutes. That's the first thing, right? The first thing is that our do now is 10 minutes. I'll tell you a little story here. When I was teaching at the Maryland School for the Blind, I was technology instructor. What would typically happen is I had this great idea. Let's make a do now so that, number one, all of my students can work on their IEP technology goals, right? Each one has a different goal. They each can have a different do now. It's a great idea, right? That's, if you have multiple students, great way to do IEP work is in that do now. Amazing. Now, the thing that would happen though, is it would be, Johnny would start his do now, and I would wait for him to finish. Right? I would wait for him to finish the do now, right? Now, if Johnny finishes the do now at a different time than Sally does, then number one, two things could happen. Number one student is waiting for another, right? Which, if you're itinerant and you're seeing students one-on-one, you're like, well, this doesn't really apply to me. But the second thing is that the second thing is that the student has to finish, right? And the student, if they try to finish every single time, the lesson begins to look like the do now. We don't want the lesson to be the do now. We want the do now to be at the beginning of the lesson, right? If we let our students finish the whole do now and we don't cut them off, we can't get to the lesson. And that's what happens with a lot of teachers. So why 10 minutes? So this is kind of a something that we have to create a balance with. We want to make sure that we cut them off at 10 minutes, but we also don't want them to be stressed to complete the do now, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to set a timer, right? I put a link in here of an example timer with music, and for our students, for students with low vision, there's a timer on the screen. But honestly, it doesn't really matter. We don't want them to be sitting there being like, I have 5 minutes left. Oh my gosh. What we really want to do is say, oh, the music stopped. No big deal if you didn't finish. Let's move on to our lesson. Real stress-free. Let's show this timer YouTube video that's on there. Oh, let's go back. Yeah, go back one slide and let's show the YouTube video timer. Awesome. And it does have music to it, but pretty much big, large print on the screen, has really calm music to it. All you need to know is when all your students need to know is when the music stops, wrap up your do now. We're moving on to the lesson, right? A great way to create that structure in a really stress-free environment, okay? Cool, we can go back to the slide deck. Awesome. Great. And then it says, if they do not finish, no big deal. They can try again next time. This is not a stressful environment. Remember, we're trying to make this fun. We're trying to make it meaningful. They're practicing their skills. Yeah, awesome. And then also just a practical matter, use that time to prepare your lesson. A lot of times with screen reader lessons, I love teaching with manipulatives, using different things, we used to do, when I was teaching technology full-time in class settings, we used to to teach tables, we would have this whole big, huge table on the floor and they would have to reach for it with candy. There's a lot of things that if you get really into it, you have to prepare a lot of stuff. Use that 10-minute do now as the beginning of, they know what they're doing. They're doing their do now. They have the timer going. I can sit here and get myself organized, right? And then also, I'm going to add one more thing that's not on the slideshow. Your 10-minute do now is a good assessment tool. If you notice that Johnny is not completing his do now, it's maybe a good sign that maybe we need to back it up, right? If he's consistently not doing that do now, back it up, do some more instruction, change the do now, whatever you need to do. If Johnny's consistently done, if he's done in 5 minutes, you need to add to that do now, right? So it's a good assessment tool, having a 10-minute cutoff. All right, let's move on to that next slide. And that is, of course, our big thing, meaningful, right? Do now that is meaningful is something that the student will use in real life, or it must be interesting, all right? It should seamlessly flow into the lesson. And at the end of the do now, the student should be closer to the beginning of the lesson, all right? What do I mean by that? Well, think about these examples. Examples being logging in, right? If the student doesn't log in the do now, they have to log in afterwards and then they're behind, right? That's meaningful. That's a natural consequence. Turning on the screen reader. If the student doesn't turn on the screen reader, they have to do it anyway, right? If the student logs in and turns on the screen reader, they are closer to the beginning of the lesson. That's what I mean by meaningful. It doesn't have to be fun. It doesn't have to be, wow, this is so exciting. We're turning on our screen reader and logging in. It's not going to be exciting, but it is meaningful. There is a natural consequence for not doing it. Let's take our other example, turning on keyboard help and finding all those modifier keys. If the student doesn't do it, what's the consequence? There is none, because you have to get to the lesson, right? Not meaningful, right? Also not very fun, but it's also not meaningful. Okay, so that's a big one. So it's 10 minutes, it's meaningful. What else is it? Let's go on to the next slide. Scaffolded, all right? This is a big education word that we've all heard in prep programs and we might forget what it actually means, but scaffolded means making a routine of steps, something that can be altered, something that can be added, something that can be taken away, okay? The common do now prescription that I often do is I make a big, huge routine of steps saying, even if Johnny is struggling to log in, I say, well, where are we trying to go? Make 10 steps. First step might be logging in. So let's have him log in and let's see how far he gets. If he's finished in 5 minutes, then I look at my routine and I say, oh, the next step is to turn on your screen reader. So then he's like, okay, got it. Logs in, turns on his screen reader. If he finishes before the 10 minutes, you say, oh, the next step is to open Google Chrome, right? So then you can have a scaffolded thing that can grow with the student. It can grow with the student. All right. Only add a step when the student does not use all 10 minutes, right? You don't want to say, here's 10 steps. That's going to be your do now. That's stressful, right? We don't want our student to feel like that. You add one step at a time. And if your student finishes, you add another step. If your student finishes, you add another step. If they can do it, if they cannot do it independently, break it down into smaller chunks. This is a big thing. A lot of times teachers say, well, what happens if my student can't log in? This is what you do. You log in for them, right? And you say, we're simulating logging in. Open a Word document, type your username. That's it. If they can't do that in 10 minutes, break it down even smaller, okay? 10 minutes is your assessment gauge, right? If they can do it in 10 minutes independently, great. If they can do more than that in 10 minutes, add more. If they can't do it in 10 minutes, break it down, okay? So that's what scaffolded means. All right, and then finally, we want to go to automaticity. Now, this is a great word. We were talking about this before everybody came in, how great of a word this is. Automaticity means, what does it mean? It means what we do every day without thinking. We do so many things as functional adults. We do so many things with automaticity. Opening up a internet browser, something we do with automaticity. Sending an email, we don't think about it. Driving, right? If you drive, you don't think about it. We want this do now to be something that we can practice to automaticity, right? These are skills that students should be able to do. Logging in, turning on a screen reader, opening an internet browser, reading with reading commands. These are all skills that they should be able to do without thinking about it. And that's what the point of a do now is, okay? So let's move on to our next slide. This is another poll question. What are the 4 components of a do now? We just went over them. What are they? Is it 10 minutes? Is it 30 minutes? Is it meaningful? Is it arbitrary, scaffolded, memorization, and can be practiced to automaticity? What do you guys think? Which are the 4 components of that do now? As I'm looking at this, lots of people starting to answer. Got about 30 people answering, 40 people. Awesome.
And Cody, we had a few questions come in.
Let's hear them. Yeah.
Great. So first one, what is a good do now for a very early beginning student?
We will totally talk about that. But as a quick answer, my early students, like when I started teaching, I started teaching screen readers in 1st grade. That's when I start. And honestly, a do now that I do for them is read this story. You know, I find a bunch of stories on ReadWorks or Newsela or on Google that are appropriate for children at their reading level, put a bunch of them in a Word document, and then I put it on a flash drive, plug in the flash drive, open the Word document, and they read it with reading commands. Why do I do that? Because it's something that is very, very early in that screen reader skills progression, right? And it gets them interacting with the keyboard in a way that's interesting, right? They're listening to a story. It's something that preschoolers, elementary school students, they do all the time. It's just in a different format. Once you get past that, then you can start to say, okay, now you're going to open up the screen reader and read the story, right? Then you're going to open up the screen reader, open up the document, read the story, right? You see how you can add to that. So that's where I start. That's a great question. Any other ones that came in, Betsy?
What age or grade level do you typically introduce a screen reader?
1st grade, for sure. 1st grade. And honestly, when I say 1st grade, I'm preparing them I'm expecting that by upper elementary, they're going to have a computer that they need to do assignments on a computer. So it's really important to get all of these fundamental skills in, because as we know, we don't have a lot of time once they start to do 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade work, right? All of a sudden, assignments become really, really important to do and take a lot more time. But also, it's really important to start teaching that screen reader once their peers have a computer in front of them, right? If their peers are using a Chromebook, I teach Chromevox when they get that Chromebook, okay? A lot of people say they wait and, you know, they say, oh, there's a laptop cart. They sometimes use the Chromebook, but we can do it on paper. Do the screen reader instruction early, because you're gonna thank yourself later, right? Even when you switch from Chromebook to maybe JAWS or NVDA, those concepts, the ability to interact with a screen reader is gonna transfer, right? People think it's totally different worlds. It's not, right? If you know Chromevox, the key commands are a little bit different, but the concepts are not, okay? So my 2 answers being as early as possible, kindergarten, 1st grade. And when you see computers in the classroom, you're already behind. So as early as possible. Yeah.
And we
Anything
have
else?
2 comments based on that feedback.
Yeah.
Someone commented it. I think sometimes we get hung up on the screen reader and get frustrated. I will Google a skill for mainstream classes and then modify it for a screen reader. And someone shared in response, I think that learning to listen to the screen reader is super important. So it's great that you start with reading.
Reading, absolutely. And honestly, that listening component, that is why in that screen reader skills progression that we start with reading, because it's important for us to understand that they're, just like I said, they have a different device in front of them. Once you turn on that screen reader, it's a different interface. All of a sudden, they have to start listening and reading a story, doing activities where we'll do this in the practice. I already have practice activities for you guys in part 3. Well, doing things where we're really focusing on listening and reading, right? That's a great place to start. Yeah, cool. All right, sweet. So we got the answers here where 10 minutes, right? It's 10 minutes, a 10-minute activity. It's meaningful, right? It's scaffolded and it can be practiced to automaticity. Remember, we're not memorizing. A lot of people say, well, it sounds like you're memorizing. We're not memorizing. We are learning the concepts, but practicing to automaticity, okay? The way that I would want to describe this is if you think about how to turn on your screen reader, right? And you say, okay, so it's Windows key, J, enter. How many times have I heard that? Ooh, man, so many times. Windows key, J, enter. That's memorizing. That's not what I want you to do in a do now. What I want you to do is open the start menu, type in the program you want, JAWS, right? And then select it. That's not memorizing. That's understanding the concepts behind it. Now I can open up the window, open up the start menu, type in the program I want, and select it to automaticity. I can do that with automaticity, but I haven't memorized it. I understand why I'm doing it, right? Windows key, J, enter. Don't teach like that. That's just memorizing. It's boring, right? So that's one of the things that I get a lot of questions of. It sounds like you're talking about memorizing. It's very similar, but it's a little bit different, okay? So great. Awesome job on that poll, guys. All right, we'll go on to the next slide here. All right, so at this point, we'll talk about, I'm gonna show you guys a do now. And we have running a little low on time, but I'll show you guys a do now. And at this point, we're gonna close the chat just because when I have the chat on, you're going to hear it, JAWS say all of the comments. So if the chat's really active. So we're going to close the chat right now. I'm going to share my screen and show you guys a do now. The first one is going to be logging in, turning on the screen reader, going to classwork section of Google Classroom. Remember, I'm showing you the whole do now, the whole routine. And we're going to, but you can also scaffold it down to a learner that's just beginning. Right? So I'm going to show you the whole do now. Do now. Silly. All right. So I'm going to share my screen here. Boom. I'm going to go. I'm going to turn on JAWS. All right. So my first one is logging in. I'm already logged in. Right. My second step is turning on the screen reader. Remember, like I said, it's not Windows key J, enter, although that will work, but it's opening the start menu, typing in the program I want. You can also just type J as long as you understand, and selecting it.
JAWS. Meeting controls.
Awesome. And just to confirm, Betsy Ann, you can hear JAWS, is that right?
Yes, I can hear JAWS.
Beautiful. All right. So the next the next step, right? So this is, if the learner can do that in 10 minutes, that's their do now. Great, right? You've scaffolded it down. They're not going to get really stressed. You say 2 steps, log in, turn on your screen reader. If they are done with that in 4 minutes, then you can move on to the next step. Let's open Google Chrome. Remember, open that start menu.
Search box edit.
Type in the program you
text.
want, right? So type in the program you want. So in this case, I'm going to open up Google Chrome.
Enter.
Right?
Who's using Chrome?
This is the new thing that Chrome does. So you have to teach them to tab through to get to the right account. I'm going to go to my IT personal.
Who's using Chrome? Open BCP. Rename your more actions button. Open eye.t personal profile button.
I'm just using
to
tab
activate,
here. I'm going to press enter. Right?
Main region.
I'm already in, right? But let's say I want to go to Google Chrome.
Control T.
So I open up a new tab. And if your learner has gotten here in 10 minutes, that's their do now. If they can log in, turn on the screen reader, open Google Chrome, and that's what they get done in 10 minutes, great, right? They are learning those tasks to automaticity. If they don't, if they finish early, then they can go to Google Classroom. You can either have them type in or you can have them go to the waffle, either one. The waffle being this, the Google Apps button collapsed is what JAWS says. All right. I'm going to have them type in. So
CLASSR boom.google.com.
I hear that.
Selected.
It says it. I'm going to
Enter.
press enter.
Classroom dash Help and feed.
And then here's where we get into kind of our internet techniques. I'm going to show you guys this because it sounds like we're interested. If you go into the IT website and make a free account, go to those screen reader cheat sheets, you'll see our method 1, our method 2, and our method 3 techniques to navigate the internet. All right. We have also tons of resources on the website about that, but I'm going to show you this right now. So I'm going to start by using method 2, which is quick keys, to get to my headings. All right. Get to my headings. Headings are titles and section titles. My classes are the titles, are their headings. So I can just press H.
Screen Reader Bootcamp 2021 visited link group A class options head visited link eye.t
to get to the right class.
Enter.
You can
List.
see how all of a sudden this do now has gotten a lot more complicated, right? And if you're saying, oh my gosh, I don't know what you're talking about, that's okay, right? That's okay. Your learner, if you're starting with a new learner, they're not going to be at this point. You have time to learn, right? But what you can start with is logging in, turning on the screen reader, opening Google Chrome, going to the address bar, typing in Google Classroom. There's lots of steps that you can get to before that, okay? So I'm going to stop my share here. Let's go back to our beautiful. And Betsy, did we have any we can open up the chat again. And if you guys have any questions about what I just did, please put them in the chat. I would love to answer them. Even if you're like, I get the do now concept, but what did you just do? That's fine. I can answer those questions as well. All right.
Great. So we got some more feedback on that. On listening is so important, and figuring out what to listen to and what to ignore from your screen reader is super important. This person describes it as like the difference between glancing or looking, both critically aware, like, you know, the idea of glancing at something versus looking. And a question did come in, you might not have time to address it right now, but how do you handle a high school student that refuses to use a screen reader?
Yeah. Wow. That is a big question. I do have an answer for it. Let me answer that at the end. So if whoever answered that question, if you can stay to the end, I can totally answer that question because I have so many ideas about it. But let's continue on this do now. Betsy, if I don't remember that, can you remind me?
I'll remember it.
Absolutely. Yes. Sweet. So let's talk about non-examples. If you still have questions about what I just did, put them in the chat. But as we do this, let's talk about non-examples. Also, this is in the last slide, but I can just very quickly mention it. For those of you who are for that novelty section, a lot of times if a student is working on typing, if they're in that phase 2 writing, what I do is I go on to Google and I look for journal prompts appropriate for middle school students. And what they do is they go into Google or they go into Microsoft Word and they write a daily journal prompt. Journal prompt might be, where do you picture yourself in 10 years? What do you picture yourself in 10 years? If you had $1 million, what would you do with it? Those types of things. If you have a student that's really creative and really expressive and really extroverted, those types of things work really, really great for them to practice typing, to navigate to Microsoft Word, all of those little skills that they need to get there. And it's also very motivating, and it also provides a little bit of novelty in that do now. So that was another example that was in the last slide. Non-examples. So this is one that a lot of people do. The concept of new now might be a little bit confusing, but let's look at these and wonder, why are these not examples? As I read these, tell us in the chat what is missing. Is it 10 minutes? 10 minutes is not going to be missing because you can make this anytime. But is it not scaffolded? Is it not meaningful? Is it not, can it not be practiced to automaticity? Let's see. Logging in, turning on the screen reader, and using the keyboard help function to practice finding modifier keys. All right, for 10 minutes. Control Alt Shift. I already told you guys that this would be a non-example, but why? Why is it not a non-example? What is it missing? Which component is it missing?
In the chat, we've heard not meaningful.
It is not meaningful, right? It can be scaffolded, I guess. It's not really a routine of steps, so that's kind of missing too. It's not meaningful. There's no natural consequence for not doing it. They're getting no closer to the lesson, so it's not meaningful. You can obviously practice it to automaticity. How about this one? Logging in and practicing turning on and off the screen reader. What's missing?
Tanya says scaffolding.
Scaffolding, sure, yeah. There's no routine. It's also not meaningful because why would you turn off the screen reader, right? Cool. Which of the following is not an example of a do now? Now, this is a poll question, okay? Is it logging in, turning on the screen reader, and completing a Google search to find the answer to a given question? Is that a good do now? Or I'm sorry, is that not an example? Is it logging in, turning on the screen reader, and practice opening and closing programs? Is that not a good example? Or is it logging in, turning on the screen reader, and reading a short story?
All right. And while people are filling in this poll, we did get another question in.
Yeah.
Should a student know the keyboard 100% before starting using a screen reader, or should they learn the keyboard as they go?
What a great controversial question. I love this question. And I'm very opinionated on this question, but I respect everybody else's opinion. A lot of people do think that you need to know the screen reader to use a keyboard. I mean, sorry, other way around. You need to know the keyboard to use a screen reader. I don't think so. The reason why I don't think so is think about that whole phase of listening and reading and understanding what's going on in your headphones, right? You don't need to know the whole keyboard, right? Also, if we wait to know the whole keyboard before we introduce a computer, you're going to be losing a lot of time, okay? I think the keyboard, when you introduce the screen reader, you create motivation for the keyboard. A lot of students think about typing programs, right? All those typing programs that we all as TVIs are obsessed with, right? Typing Club, Typeo. Now, they do a great job of trying to make it fun for our learners, but typing practice as a fundamental is not fun. It's not meaningful, right? It can be fun. It's not meaningful. What we do when we introduce the screen reader before the keyboard is we say, oh, we can't do this until you learn the keyboard. So you have to practice typing, right? So we're creating the meaning for the keyboarding. And that's kind of what my opinion is. And that's what I found most effective, is that you can create that meaning of typing through teaching a screen reader first. Yeah. As we look at the poll, the correct answer, the thing that I label as the correct answer, was the second one: logging in, turning on the screen reader, and practice opening and closing programs. Why is that not an example of a do now? Tell us in the chat. Why is that not an example? All right. As you do that, I'll ask you in a second, Betsy, what people say. But as you do that, I'm going to start talking about why the number 1 and number 3 are good examples. Logging in, turning on a screen reader, and completing a Google search to find the answer to a given question. Wow. Is it 10 minutes? Sure, it can be 10 minutes. Is it scaffolded? Absolutely. There's a total routine of steps that you can put in there. You can also break it down. You can just have them log in, turn on the screen reader, and go to Google, and then you can Google the question. You can have them log in, turn on the screen reader, go to Google, type in the question, and you can read the answers, right? It's totally scaffolded. What am I missing? Is it meaningful? Absolutely. How many times a day do we Google questions? It's totally meaningful. It's a skill that students that you can incorporate their questions into. You can also incorporate really interesting questions into. And can they practice it to automaticity? Absolutely. Proof is in the pudding that all of us can Google questions on Google to automaticity, right? We've practiced that to automaticity. So that meets all of our components. The third one, logging in, turning on a screen reader, and reading a short story. Number 1, is it 10 minutes? Sure. Number 2, is it scaffolded? Absolutely. Just like I said, log in, turn on a screen reader. If that's where they stop, great. Log in, turn on a screen reader, open Microsoft Word. If that's where they stop, great. Log in, turn on a screen reader, open a Microsoft Word, read the first paragraph. If that's where they get, fine, you can read the rest later, right? So it's scaffolded. Is it meaningful? Absolutely. We need to read as screen reader users. That's how you read, right? Whether you're using a Braille display, which is a different topic a little bit, but whether you're using a Braille display or you're just listening, right? That's how you read. The reading commands never change. Whether you're an adult or a kindergarten screen reader user, you're going to read the same way. It's meaningful. And can it be practiced to automaticity? Absolutely. Reading commands can be practiced to automaticity. Yeah. Betsy, what did we get for the second one? Logging in, turning on a screen reader, practice opening and closing programs. Why is that not a good example of a good do now?
So a lot of people said it wasn't meaningful. Someone said there was no finished product at the end.
Yes.
It wasn't motivating.
Yes.
And it doesn't get you closer to the lesson. It's empty
Yes.
repetition, or it's not scaffolded and therefore not meaningful. And finally, they don't learn how the skills they use can actually function.
Absolutely. I love whoever said there's no finished product at the end. Thank you. You've made my entire day, because yes, that's what I look for is there a finished product? Is there something that they have done, right? Is there something they can point to and say, I've done this? If they have, if you're doing opening and closing programs, you can't point to anything. You have no programs open, right? You can say to the student, you have no programs open. Well, you told me to open and close programs. I don't know what you want. I'm just in the middle of closing a program. They can just sit there and do nothing and do nothing, you know? So yeah, absolutely. Those are all great great reasons. But yeah, great. It sounds like you guys are really getting the idea. All right, awesome. Let's go on to the next slide. We're kind of finishing up here. And here we've gotten to the logistics of the do now, right? How do we create our do now? All right. Well, what you do is, number one, you identify a skill in the screen reader skills progression, right? It's probably going to be one of those early tedious skills, right? A lot of times you can see logging in, which is typing, keyboarding, turning on the screen reader, which is opening and closing. Turning on the screen reader is the first skill in that screen reader progression. Opening and closing programs is one that we often put in a screen reader. Typing, keyboarding is one that we often put in. Using internet, using the internet methods of navigation, using tab, those are things that can be in there. So all of these are skills that you need to work on, right? So identify those skills. What do you do next? You write your routine. Remember, write the entire thing so that on Tuesday, June 4th, when Johnny finally completes his do now in 10 minutes, you can say, great, I have another step for you. I've already written it, wrote it back in September, right? So write that routine. Prepare a data keeping system. This can be super simple. All it is you have a data sheet and you mark which step they stopped on, which step they completed, right? Remember, you're doing it at an even interval. You're doing 10 minutes, right? So if you have a data sheet and you can mark every time that you do the do now, they do a different skill, then you can see their progression. Super simple, very easy to incorporate, not a big thing that you need to incorporate into your lesson. So prepare a data keeping system, complete the instruction. So pretty much you need to do a lesson on how to do the do now, right? That needs to be a lesson. And then prepare the system if needed. You need to, if you're doing the journal prompts, you need to go and find journal prompts. If you're doing short stories, you need to go find short stories. You need to decide am I going to put this on a flash drive? Is it going to be in their Google Classroom? Where is it going to be, right? And then implement. The goal of the do now is they sit there for 10 minutes and they practice things that you've already taught them. You're not sitting there with them on the do now. They're doing this totally independently. So you implement that in your lesson. Okay. Let's move on to our next slide. Before we even get to this, I just want to ask, is there any questions in the chat, Betsy?
Okay, so one just came in. Does the do now sort of, does it function as a review of lessons?
Kind of. It's a review, but kind of a large scale review, being that think about as, so you don't want to do every task as a do now, right? If you are doing like reading OCR, reading inaccessible text with OCR, that's not a really great do now because it doesn't kind of fit the do now structure. It's mainly for those younger I shouldn't say it's mainly for the younger learners, but it's mainly for those learners that are practicing those skills that should be automatic, reviewing those skills. So yes, in a sense, you are reviewing instruction you've already done. Yes. But should it be done for every single objective? Should you review every single objective with a do now? No, you still want to keep that structure so that we can keep that consistency. Okay, great question. Great question. Anything else?
We had two pretty technical questions come in that we can save to
Sure.
the end to make sure we get through to everything.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah, cool.
Just a note, I would love to hear about how you use manipulatives for teaching screen readers in part 3 or part 4.
Yes, absolutely. We'll talk about all of that. We can do, it'll be a webinar, so I'll show a lot of on-screen manipulatives, but I'll also dig through my resources and show you guys maybe some pictures or some things that we've done in the past where we can take the screen reader lesson and really bring it outside of the computer, right? which is really a lot of fun. And that's one of the things that I love doing. Cool. All right, sweet. So I wanted to show you guys this because a lot of times this series I know is very instruction based, right? We didn't really cover a lot of how to use a screen reader, and that if that's something that you're interested in, we have tons and tons of resources on our website. One of them being one of the more popular things that we have. It's called the Screen Reader Curriculum. There's a teacher version, there's an instructor version. And it teaches you the main elements of how to use the screen reader on the internet. That's JAWS, NVDA, or Chromevox. Okay, there's key commands for all three in that curriculum. There's 60 plus instructional videos in the instructor version, 40 plus in the student version. There's both student and teacher editions. There's lesson plans, quizzes and tests, connected student data. So once your student completes something, you get an email with their data, right? A quiz or a test. There's practice problems, mock websites, practice activities. If you want to see those in action, you'll come to part 3. And data sheets, and all that is available on our website at itvision.com. If we can throw that in the chat, that'll be awesome.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and if we go to the next slide, something that we're really, really, really excited about is our very first upcoming screen reader boot camp, summer screen reader boot camp. Now, this is for students that are kind of, I would say like a screen reader emergency. Either they have a sudden loss of vision, or you find this kid and you're like, oh my gosh, why have you not learned how to use a computer? We take 2 weeks, an hour a day, and we do live student instruction in a class of only 2 or 3. So it's real small class sizes. With that, the student gets a free copy of the screen reader curriculum. As long as the parent releases information to the TVI, you get a TVI report card with assessment data, so you can start fresh from September, and a free t-shirt for the student. So all of that is available at the registration link, if we can throw that in the chat as well. If you have, with that, there is we're also offering a $250 scholarship for tuition on that. It's a $500 charge, but if you are interested in the scholarship, make sure you register early, because technically registration is closed. But I wanted to say it in this webinar just to get anybody that I missed in our email list. So if you're interested in this, sign up like today, because we're going to start to send out letters soon. Okay, great. And for next time, we're going to review the practice activity, which is my favorite part, because it's fun. These have been like the boring, tedious parts that we needed to go through. For the practice activities, it's just going to be me telling you all of this stuff that I've done in the past that's kind of goofy and fun and kind of all over the place. But really to get our students really engaged in our screen reader lesson. So that's next time. It's going to be on August 10th. Is that right, Betsy?
That is true. August 10th, and then the 4th and final of our series of 4 will be on September 14th. Those will be at the same time, so they'll start 4 p.m. Eastern time and end 5:30 p.m. Eastern time.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, if you watch this and you're like, I want to see part 1, go on to APH's YouTube channel and watch that part 1.
Yes, I can drop the link directly in the chat, so you can go straight there and grab the first video.
Absolutely. Cool. All right, let's move on to that next slide. And then just to tell you guys about all other stuff we do, and I promise this is the last little promo, is this is all of our free content. If you're on Instagram, if you follow us, it's at itvision, EYETVISION. We have Tech Tip Tuesdays, which we just halted for the summer, but there's tons of tech tips on there, where we do 1-2-minute videos to show you problems that people have in JAWS and how to fix them. JAWS, NVDA, Chromebox. If you join our Facebook group, AT for VI Professionals, we do controversial questions in the vision field. This week's question was, if you have a student with a visual impairment who is resistant to using technology, what do you do with them, right? Oh, I'm sorry. This week's question was, if a student is struggling with assignments, what do you do with their resource period? Do you continue with IEP goals, or do you work on their assignments? That was this week's question. If you want to get in on that conversation, follow us on Facebook and join the group, AT for VI Professionals. And then you can always, always, always email us at info@itvision.com. Either I or one of my partners in crime will email you back, or forward it on to me so I can answer your question. All right, so that is what we do. All of that is available for free. All right. Cool. So discoveries. All right, what did we learn in this webinar? Well, a do now, number one, is an effective strategy to create structure in a lesson. Remember, structure being beginning, middle, end. The do now covers that beginning. Do nows are a tool that we can use to help our learners practice tedious skills consistently. Remember, opening and closing programs, not a great way to teach, but a do now helps us practice that in a meaningful way. A good do now is 10 minutes. It's meaningful, scaffolded, and automatic. And don't forget to have fun. That's the biggest thing through this whole series is screen reader lessons do not have to be these tedious drudgery of lessons that we all dread, right? We want to make sure that we can have fun with them as well. Okay. Cool.
All right. Well, we've got a little bit of time left now at the end of the webinar. Of course, you've got lots of links in the chat to go through. For those of you who are joining us on the phone or don't have access to the chat for other reasons, we're going to try and get these bundled into a handout for next time. That'll be on the APH handouts page when we get that published. So let's go back and talk through a few of those questions that we had to skip just to make sure we got through all of our content today. Do we want to go back to the question about the high schooler who is reluctant to use the screen reader?
Yeah, let's do it. So this is a great question, and it's something that we run into all the time, right? It's really, and this is the same approach that I have for our dual media kids. Anybody that's resistant to using a screen reader, they say, I can use my vision, I'm fine. What I do is I do a five rated scale, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I do 2 factors that I measure. The first factor that I have them measure is task completion. So what I do is I say, that's fine. I'm not telling you you have to use a screen reader, but what we're going to do is we're going to start by understanding, number one, when you do a task, I'm going to ask you to rate yourself on 1 to 5. Did you complete the task effectively, right? So let's say the task is go in a Google Classroom and answering a question, right? They do it. I let them go through the whole process. If they need to use a screen reader with and they're using their vision, right? They're sitting there struggling, whatever. I say, how do you rate yourself 1 to 5? If you are nice and gentle, usually they'll get to a point where they say it wasn't very good, right? If they disagree, I say, I think I disagree, and I give them reasons why. The second thing that I have them measure them on is their back, right? All the time, right? All day long, we see kids and they look like this, right? In their computer screen, forehead to the computer screen, right? So what I tell them is I say, how good was your back? Was it 1 where you hunched over, nose to the screen, or were you 5 back nice and straight? Once they do that task, I say, task completion, what did you rate yourself? 1 to 5. Back, what do you rate yourself? 1 to 5. They rate themselves, usually if they need to learn how to use a screen reader and they're resistant, they rate themselves pretty low. And then I say, let's try to get a little bit better, right? And every time that we do this, I say, listen, all that means if you rate yourself low is we need to change something. I'm not telling you what you change. Not going to tell you what you need to change, but we need to change something to get a higher rating, right? So I say, what do we need to change, right? And they say, well, maybe we need to make things bigger. Okay, let's do it. Make things bigger, do the task again, rate themselves, right? They may rate themselves still pretty low. What do we need to change? At a point, if they're really resistant, they get to a point where they have no idea what they can change. And I say, let's try this. Let's try to turn on the screen reader. And I'm going to teach you 2 things and make the instruction nice and simple, nice and quick. We're going to do the same task visually. You're going to rate yourself. And you're going to do the same task with the screen reader. You're going to rate yourself. Every single time, they rate themselves higher with the screen reader. This is a very long process, right? It's a long process. It's something that I've worked with kids for years and we're still working on this process, but it's effective. The reason it's effective is because I'm not pushing the screen reader on them. I'm giving them, informing them of what their options are, and then they're deciding when they use the screen reader. Eventually, they're like, yeah, I think the screen reader is better. And then we get to a point. I've had so many kids that we've done this for, depending on how stubborn they are, we've done this for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. I definitely have students that I've been doing this for 2 years. I'm waiting for them to get to that point. But then there's a point where they're like, okay, I'm ready. And at that point, I'm like, great, let's start, you know, and that's where we start screen reader instruction. Now, is it the only solution? No, but it's the one that I've found I use every single time, because every single time it works. It's just a matter of time. It takes a long time. So yeah. Cool. What other questions, the technical questions did we have?
Ooh, okay. Let me find those. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Technical question. Are there reading commands with Chromevox in Google Docs? So far, I've only discovered arrow up and down keys.
Yes. So the 4 main reading commands that I always recommend, and typically Freedom Scientific, they have lots of different reading commands, but the 4 main that work with most screen readers are right and left arrow key for letters, control right and left for words, right? Up and down for lines, and then control up and down for paragraphs. That works on the internet. That works in Microsoft Word with JAWS. It works with NVDA. It works with Chromevox. It works with everything. Now, is there a way to read all in Google Docs? If there is, I haven't found it yet. Unfortunate. But those are the 4 ones that I recommend starting with: is letter by letter, character by character, word by word, line by line, paragraph by paragraph. Okay. Most of the time for students, that's all you need, right?
All right, and we've got just 3 minutes left in this webinar. We'll take a look at one more technical question.
Sure.
How does a student log in before turning JAWS on?
Right. So I can actually show you this right now. So what you're going to do is, I'm going to share my screen because it's honestly an easy answer. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that, and this is the problem, is if you're on a school district network, a lot of times you need an administrator access to do this. But let me turn on JAWS. And what you can do this yourself. You only have to do it one time. But you're going to go to
eye.t-5 free JAWS professional.
JAWS, right? You're going to go to the options menu. It's Alt-O, or you can just click on it if you're a visual user. You're going to go to basics.
Enter. Leaving menus.
And then you're going to go to automatically start JAWS.
Access automatically start JAWS. Start JAWS options dialog.
Then you're going to check automatically start JAWS on the login screen, and JAWS will be on that student's login screen. You can also do this with NVDA too.
JAWS home manual.
Let me turn off JAWS. Whoop.
JAWS find dialog. Escape. JAWS home manual. Unloading JAWS. Enter.
If you turn on NVDA, you have the same options in the NVDA settings as well. Okay, so it's not necessarily turning on JAWS. It's just you have to check those boxes and make sure those settings are correct. Then JAWS will be on the login screen. Great question.
All right, we had a few more questions come in towards the end. We do want to make sure that you guys are following us for our 2 webinars in the future. Those are, again, August 10th and September 14th. We hope you'll come back, and if you didn't get your question answered at this time, hopefully you can remember it and bring it to those next webinars. So with 1 minute left, we want to spend our time thanking you, Cody, again.
Absolutely.
For these fantastic webinars. We've had so many great responses in the chat, so many people who are just really excited for this content and are really excited to keep following us on this adventure as we continue through 4 parts of our 4-part webinar series. So thank you, Cody, and thanks to Paul and Nikki for helping with this webinar and ACF's captions.